Hey, AP Lang teachers, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. Today's video is going to be a teacher tip video. Several of you had asked about incorporating novel length works into your AP curriculum. And I'm going to be really honest. I don't actually teach a novel length work in my AP class. I do teach one in Honors 11 and College English. But when I got this question, I thought of one person who knows a whole lot about not only incorporating fiction and nonfiction into AP Lang, but also making it fun and engaging for kids. And that's Amanda from Muddening Teaching. Yes, she's awesome. If you guys are not following her on Instagram, she does like Instagram PD where she gives you all these different activities to try. And she shows you not just what to do, but why we do it, which is super important. So definitely check that out because I'm telling you, I had to sit through like 30 hours of PD on the computer this summer, and everything she does on Instagram is way better than those 30 hours that I had to sit through. So go check her out. I'll link everything in the description below. But Amanda, welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me, Beth.
Yeah, no problem. I'm excited to chat because I know that you've definitely got a unique perspective on this because I believe you taught, was it Gatsby and Columbine when you did
Yes.
AP?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so a little bit of the fiction, little nonfiction. Okay, I'd love to hear your perspective on that. But first, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself in case the viewers aren't familiar with who you are?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Amanda. My students call me Mrs. Cardenas. This is would be my 14th year of teaching. I'm actually on a little bit of a leave for the time being for a lot of reasons, but I'm currently not in the classroom at this moment, but I've been teaching for 13 years. Actually, only 2 of those have been AP Lang, but I've been mentored by AP Lang teachers my whole life. The class that changed my life in high school was my AP Lang class. I can still remember my AP Lang teacher. She's a retired department chair at a school not too far from here. And I remember she sat me down, and I tell my students this every year. I say, she sat me down after my first essay, and that was back on the 9 scale. And I got maybe a 3 on my first in-class essay. And I walked up to her and I said, Mrs. Tancredi, this is not right. I'm a very good writer. This should not be my score. And she said, Amanda, why don't we talk after class? And I was like, I'm a good kid, right? Like I knew how to, figure out a rubric and do all the right things. And of course we all know that now, like that's not what Lang is. Mm-hmm. And she sat me down and said, Amanda, you're just not that great of a writer. And I was like, I cried instantly. It was traumatic, but she held my shoulder and she said, but not yet. And that's what I'm here for, is to show you a new way. You're writing like you always used to. And I'm here to show you how to do something different. And I was just like, I was her puppy. Like I never left her side. I was her shadow. And I learned so much from her. And it really helped me as an AP Lang teacher to take on that role of mentor and guide. And like, it's okay to expect hard things and to give honest scores to kids and to also be there for them, right? As that bridge between what they used to know about writing and what they're going to be able to do as writers moving forward. So love AP Lang, love teaching. I absolutely adore everything that we work on. And only other thing that's useful to know in this situation is I spent 10 years at one school and 3 at the one I just recently resigned from. And that's where I taught Lang. So very, very recent is my Lang experience.
Awesome. Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that whole transformation process because especially right now at the beginning of the year, so many kids are just diving into AP Lang and they're starting to realize, yeah, it's hard. It's maybe not like your previous classes, even if they did pre-AP or honors. And, those kids that are used to like hundreds on every essay and then suddenly they don't get 100, like that's a scary time, but it's so worth it. Honestly, I tell my students, I think AP Lang is probably one of the most valuable classes they could take, 100%. Period. Mm-hmm. Just because it helps them not just learn to write, but to think critically. And there's a lot of like citizenship stuff that goes on in the classroom too, that they might not be aware of, but it's totally there. So I think it's probably one of the most important classes that they could take. So let's go ahead and kind of talk about having to incorporate novel length works into this. Because I know some teachers, maybe it's because their district has copies of a text and they have to use it, or maybe it's their state standards. It might be fiction. I know a lot of people teach Gatsby because it seems to go in 11th grade. And then there's a lot of talk about Just Mercy and Educated. So I'm curious from your perspective, because I know from watching your Instagram stories how well read you are. if you could adopt any like nonfiction or fiction work in an AP Lang curriculum, what would you choose and why?
So I don't want to jump ahead in our conversation, but I think that all really just depends on the essential questions, right? Like that to me, the whether we're using short pieces or long pieces, the unit of study that I really like to sink my teeth into is something that's driven by an essential question. And I think that's a little contradictory to what AP and College Board have given us in terms of this skills spiral type of curriculum. So I don't ignore that. But for me, I think packaging that differently is very helpful for me as a teacher and for my students from just the standpoint of like tracing their learning conceptually. So I don't want to avoid your question, but I would say one text I wish I would have gotten the chance to teach the entirety of is There There by Tommy Orange. I think There There, and a couple other texts are similar to that. There There is a collection of short stories that all connect. Homegoing is another great example that's set up similarly to There There. And I like this because like the pieces are short. You could study one small section and then look at the whole, and it's kind of how everything fits together kind of like a puzzle. And that would be really interesting to do for Lang, considering it's basically synthesis, right? It's fictional, but it's also synthesis. So that really excites me. I really did love teaching Gatsby and Lang. You have a lot of different conversations in AP with Gatsby than you do in other 11th grade classes, which is very cool. And we can talk more about that later. So I loved teaching Gatsby and I loved throwing him under the bus and, all kinds of very aggressive things. I've also always dreamed of doing a nonfiction lit circle and having kids do books in small groups, books like you mentioned, To Educated is awesome. Just Mercy. I recently finished reading The Devil's Highway. It's about the immigration from Mexico across the border and like the actual, the author walked with people on that journey and, very vividly and painfully described what that's like. Stories like that just really resonate with me. The nonfiction, it'd be really cool to do lit circles with Lang because they can very much handle the group work and self-pacing their reading. So any kind of lit circle would be a great option. And then we've also done a lot of choice reading, where kids are reading independently outside of class and connecting those texts to other issues is kind of how we've seen it used.
Okay, well, great. Yeah, I like what you said about essential questions, because I think what I notice sometimes, especially when people just find out they're teaching AP Lang, they're like, okay, wait a minute, like which novels do I need? Or like, what do I do? And I think sometimes, and I get it, because I've kind of fallen victim to this too. It's like, we want to choose maybe like a popular title, but we maybe don't think about why we're actually assigning that work. Because I had to go through something similar this year for our college English class. We were told we had to choose a different book. And I was like, but we had to think about a Lexile too. And I was like, but the content is what I care about. I don't care about the Lexile. So I had this list and I was like, okay, which one is going to be engaging and what can I ask my students to think about and talk about rather than just thinking about the popularity of a work. So I think the essential question thing might be a really great topic to kind of jump into. And so I guess, why don't you just kind of like give us an overview? Like, how do we choose an essential question? Like, what do we do with it?
Yeah. So essential questions are, kind of for me, transcend levels, right? So I use that's really just kind of like the framework. Inquiry-based learning is the framework that I operate all of my curriculum under. So a lot of that work I can link, originators of that work in the description box for everybody. But what that looks like in a research PD book versus in real life and applied to AP is very different than, what you're going to get out of that. So in very simple terms, I write my essential questions based on a trifecta. So the trifecta is texts, themes, and skills. So to come up with an essential question requires, a different balance of those three. It's not always an equal weight. So if I'm entering on like the course description, right, of AP, and I'm going into a rhetorical analysis unit, I really like most of the skills, the heavy, right, weight of skills is on RA. I'm probably not going to choose fiction, right? Like my text in that unit would be something nonfiction or would be a series of smaller pieces. But there are units that are not quite as heavily dedicated to RA where I might choose a different text, right? So if I know that I have an RA skill-based unit, I have some short pieces, then I want to know like thematically what could powerfully connect those texts together, or pick my theme first and then pick my texts that I want to connect there. So once you kind of have those three things happening, that's where you start to draft an essential question. So to give a couple of just quick examples, we'll look at Gatsby. Okay. So when we did Gatsby, the unit was really heavily based on synthesis. And we were looking at Gatsby, and then American Dream is something that's kind of coming up in our year in other levels. And so we kind of went with it. And the essential question we used was, is the American Dream more likely to inspire or destroy us?
Oh, I love that.
So, right. So, and if you hear that question and you're an AP Lang teacher, you're like, oh, that's how it fits in Lang. Because if you have an essential question based unit, it's an argument.
Exactly. It's an argument. So, right. So it's not just your topic is American Dream, but we don't want to just say, oh, my unit is American Dream. We need a question that the kids have to answer.
Yes. And so we try to evaluate that at the beginning, kind of the middle and the end. And they, with a question like that, it's kind of cool, inspire or destroy. Clearly it's not 100% one or 100% the other, which is great for kids to start learning about warrants and, conditional statements and crafting claims that are very nuanced. Not that the thesis point matters, whatever.
Right.
But it's good for them to start, kind of seeing things on a scale. I don't know about other teachers, but I think that was one thing I struggled with my juniors so much was everything is so black and white. They really struggle with the gray. And so giving them questions that kind of establish a scale, and they have to fight in here with all of the text. So not just Gatsby, but we would listen to the podcast Gangster Capitalism. It's a oh my gosh, I'm going to forget the name of the original, the host, but he is basically investigating the college admission scandal. And like Lori Loughlin and everyone who's paying their way into college and getting in through the front door, the back door, the side door, and how, the wealthy of America are currently taking advantage of the system. And, we're looking at Gatsby in contrast with that. And then, and then you just keep layering in poetry, nonfiction, you layer. And then as the unit progresses, kids have a more complex understanding of that question and a more complex answer. And that's what we want to get out of them at the end when we get to the exam, is that they can be aware of complexity on their own.
Yeah. And I love what you said about it's not always black and white, because a lot of the phrasing I've seen sometimes is like the to what extent. And those questions, and my students are always kind of like, what do they mean? And I'm like, okay, well, it's not always just this or this. Sometimes there's areas in the middle that we need to explore. So I love that what you're saying about Gatsby too. So I think a lot of teachers use Gatsby. So what I'm hearing is you might have this anchor text, but we need to bring in supplemental materials to really get kids to be thinking about the issue, not just the text itself.
Yes, 100%. And giving yourself permission to step aside from plot, put that on the student's shoulders. And don't stress out about chapter quizzes and all that. No, assign what you're going to assign and talk about what you're going to talk about. And if the kids don't get you to hold their hands through every plot moment of what you're reading, that's okay. That's okay. It's going to be fine.
Yeah. And I definitely want to pick your brain about that later. Cause I remember when I was in high school, we would read a chapter and then we'd come in the next day and there'd be a quiz. And our teacher would always tell us, if you use Spark Notes, you're going to fail. And then lo and behold, everybody who used Spark Notes did just fine. All these reading quizzes. And so as an English teacher, sometimes it's like, how do I assess them fairly and hold them accountable, but at the same time, make it engaging? Because there is something to be said for routine. Don't get me wrong, but we don't want to do reading quizzes every day because that just gets tedious for everybody. So maybe we could talk about, before we talk about assessments and fun stuff to do, maybe we could talk about for those that want to incorporate more rhetorical analysis, but they do have this longer work that they're doing. How can they choose passages for a close reading?
I would say, first of all, close reading, the shorter, the better.
Okay.
I think a lot of times, even what we get on RA from Lang is long. I wouldn't even call that close reading. I mean, eventually the kids get good enough to do that in that amount of time, but close reading for me is 1 or 2 paragraphs. Because if you're going to process it together, a typical lesson for me would go, whatever warm up there is, doing something together, something in pairs or groups, and then something back together as a whole. Mm-hmm. And that's a lot of moving pieces. So you can't have a text that's too big. Otherwise kids they're going to lose the details, and you want them to see the details. That's really, really important. So that's my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice would be to choose something that is going to give them commentary on that essential question. So rather than choosing something maybe that's like a plot height moment, it might even be like a sidebar, if we're going to stick with Gatsby, some like Nick commentary on what he sees in America at the time, or, observational sidebar stuff that doesn't always get as much playtime as other more popular passages. And that way the kids can look at the tone, right? Tone is universal. Tone is literature and nonfiction. So absolutely you can hit tone. And then you could also hit things like syntax and diction. It's so unique to look at what authors of fiction do versus what public speakers or the commencement speeches are using. It's very different. So it's kind of nice to have that coloring. And then anything else, you're not really going to get a lot of appeals, which is fine because we don't really want to obsess over those anyway, but you're going to see a lot of other types of just literary devices, poetic devices. And again, those are all going to add up to create tone and authors or speakers' attitude toward a subject. And that subject, right? The conclusion of that lesson is, so what's the commentary on this American dream thing? Is it inspiring us or destroying us? And so you can keep coming back to that bigger argument. That really helps. The kind of just thread everything together. And don't be afraid to do RA of some of those supplemental texts too. Right? If you're gonna pull an article from the New York Times that fits really nicely with the chapter that you're on, or you're gonna pull, I don't know, a speech that goes really nicely, like the topics connect, but they're, different forms of text. Like you can do RA on that stuff too, and have a lot of success with students, and they'll enjoy it.
Yeah, I love what you said about the shorter passages, because I know for the exam, they say it's roughly between like 600 and 800 words, which maybe by May is fine. And I think there's a time and a place for that. I definitely like to use like former exam passages because, the College Board has put it out there, so it's helpful. But sometimes that's just too much to tackle, especially in one class period. But at the beginning of the year, when people are just starting to cover the rhetorical situation and then rhetorical choices, those shorter passages are much more manageable. And I think that like scaffolding, like starting small, because I tell my students like, we don't write an essay for a while in here. And like, I have this reputation of making kids write thousands of essays. I don't know where that came from, but I'm like, no, we don't actually start. We don't actually start with essays. We start with like thesis statements and paragraphs because it has to be manageable. But I think maybe that same thing applies to choosing the passages to close read. Like, just like we don't want to start with an essay too quickly because we haven't taught those skills. For close reading, I think you're absolutely right. It has to be something shorter and more manageable to build that confidence too. Because I think RA is like somehow weirdly scary. Like, I don't know, maybe it's just like my kids, but I have them as 10th graders too. So I feel fortunate in that area, but they come into 10th grade and they're like, what is rhetorical analysis? And I'm like, well, let me tell you, it's like, they say they've never heard of it before, but then like, I think it's more that like as English teachers, sometimes especially if we don't think about Lang, we tend to push like the poetry and the novels, but that close reading is really important with nonfiction as well.
Yeah. And I think exactly to your point, like demystifying the horror of this. And also to your point, I think that's another helpful piece in choosing close read passages for me that I didn't mention is sections that have a very strong rhetorical situation. And when the audience and the speaker and what we know about them is very clear, and there's a moment where like Shakespeare is awesome. Like we've done so much good RA with anything Brutus has like ever said, right? Right. Right. I mean, or so that's beautiful. Anytime a character is trying to get another character to do something, that's definitely time for RA. I actually start my year with Beauty and the Beast. I start with the scenario of when Lumiere is singing Be Our Guest. Be Our Guest to me is a rhetorical appeal. I mean, he is begging her to stay, and against all logic, right? Like, why? You just kidnapped my dad, you kidnapped me, you're threatening me left and right, and some wardrobe came to life and dressed me. Like, there are no reasons for Belle to hang out in this creepy, awful castle where she is absolutely, her life is threatened. But Lumiere makes a lot of decisions. He doesn't sit there and give her a list of reasons to stay. He entertains her. He pulls out all the stops, and kids really sink their teeth into that. I know I've seen people use Under the Sea with The Little Mermaid similarly. And sometimes that really can help. And that's fiction, right? That's film. And the rhetorical situation, sometimes when that kids feel confident about that, they feel more confident going inside the triangle.
Yes. And so because we're filming this now, it's September, people are just starting their year. I think that the important thing maybe to talk about a little bit is the rhetorical situation, because I think you and I both sort of start with that in different ways. And so Beauty and the Beast, super approachable, because the kids have never thought about like why she stayed. I bet, at least like I never did. I was like, oh, okay. But he's actually quite convincing and effective in there. Yeah.
It works, right? She stays.
Yeah, she stays. And then for me, I saw on your Instagrams yesterday that you were doing, like you had mentioned, like a Super Bowl commercial. I like to start with commercials sometimes at the beginning of the year too. I love Nike commercials. Maybe it's because I'm a former athlete, but Nike, they have a couple different commercials where they have definite like contrast, like visually and in the rhetoric, and it helps convey a certain message. And so I like breaking those down, like, who are they targeting? Because the audience isn't everyone, like they're targeting a specific group of people.
I think that's why I stopped doing commercials, because it was so hard for them to get audience. So good for you. That was always really hard for me. The kids just never, they're like, the audience is whoever's watching.
Right. Well, we did one. Nike has a lot, especially more recently, geared toward female athletes. So this is my first year not coaching. I used to coach high school girls soccer. And so my athletes would always be like, they would like those ones. Yeah. Girls sports sometimes are not always appreciated. And this year I had given students one about the National Guard, because I knew I was getting a few kids that do our ROTC program. And so one of the questions was, who's the audience? And they said, well, people that are being recruited. And I was like, well, am I the audience? Because I'm 31, like I'm not the audience of this commercial. And they're like, oh no, like it's more people in our demographic. I'm like, okay, there you go. So it's not everyone. It's a certain group of people. So yeah, I think you have to choose your commercials wisely, but that audience component of like, they're not talking to everybody. They're talking to now, sometimes I've seen a couple where it is geared toward parents, but like parents being okay with it. But yeah, you got to narrow it down. So commercials can help. I love the idea of using Disney because that's so approachable. And it's something they're already familiar with, but it's making them think about it like differently too, which I think is fun. So I love those ideas. So maybe now that we've kind of talked a little bit about like choosing a passage and going for that, like almost like what might feel like too short, right? We don't just a paragraph or two to really dig into. How can we assess students? Like, what do we do that's not a reading quiz every day?
Oh my gosh, what a great question. So if we're going to kind of back up and talk about, doing a unit where the central text is a novel length something, right? Whether it's nonfiction or fiction, there is something to be said for accountability of some type of reading pace. And I have found that once a week, maybe once every 2 weeks seems to be plenty to kind of check in on that. And so one way that I've found success there is by assigning bigger chunks at a time. AP kids all kids, let's be very clear, are incredibly busy after school.
Yes.
And especially with what's going on with people being in, out, COVID, quarantine, who knows? I think I like to give kids the liberty to find their reading time when they can. So like with a bigger text, I try to assign, like if we give like Fahrenheit, for example, right? Like Fahrenheit's a great example of 3 parts. So part 1, in its entirety is due at this point, part 2, part 3. And that really helps me not only not only kind of be a little bit more honest with each other, but I can then teach a whole rather than feeling compelled that each lesson has to hinge on the night before's assignment. I'm a more like big picture kind of teacher anyway. And so when I do assess their progress, I try to keep it relatively open-ended. So I'll do like paragraph chunk quizzes or Sesame Street quizzes, things that let students show me what they do know rather than being marked down for what they didn't do. So that's a key for me, is to, yes, we should formatively be assessing their reading, but also letting them show us what they can do. And then in terms of other assessments, one pagers are go-tos for me. Fishbowl, 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 Socratic, Socratic, Socratic. Let's bring this into a discussion. I talked to Tim Freitas. I know a lot of you guys know Tim at Garden of English. Tim and I did a video a little while ago about using Parlay. Parlay Ideas is a big fan. I'm a huge fan of using Parlay to do virtual discussions and in-person discussions. We just do a lot of talking.
Yeah, no, we do too. It's actually funny because this is my last week of maternity leave, and I have my students sometimes for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade in some cases. And so I did a check-in form with them. And so my seniors, that it's now their third year with me, the most common thing was like, we miss discussions, we miss talking. And I think sometimes a fear is like, okay, some of the texts we read deal with some very real, very profound topics, and like, our kids going to be able to discuss that appropriately. So, setting parameters is important, but they like to talk. And even the quiet kids, giving them an opportunity to express themselves is important. So you mentioned Sesame Street quizzes. I don't know that I'm familiar with that one. So what is a Sesame Street quiz? Because that sounds really cool.
A Sesame Street quiz. No copyright infringement intended here. But like every other name I've tried to come up with, it is so dumb. So a Sesame Street quiz is based off of the idea and the song, "One of these things is not like the other." That's
okay.
And so the quiz is a 4-item list. So question 1 might say Daisy, Tom, red, mansion. So your job as a student is to tell me which one of these things does not belong, 1, and 2, or reverse, doesn't matter which they do first. The second step is to then defend the connection between the remaining 3. And so you would probably say in this little example I'm giving you right now, right, Tom, red, and mansion belong together because, right, Tom is described with the color red and living in a mansion in chapter 1. Daisy does not belong because she's just kind of on the side there, right? Like she is not red, she is white, she is a part of the mansion, it's not hers. So kids are making arguments.
I love that. They're having to assert a position and defend that claim, which is super important.
Yes. And that was a really very off the cuff example. We do a lot of examples with ordinary things to practice, things like vegetables and fruits and whatever, like all kinds of things. But what we love about those Sesame Street questions, and I say we, because this is my friend Marie and I talk a lot about this on our podcast, Brave New Teaching. This is what we talk about all the time. But we want to give that equitable chance for students to show what they do know. So even if a kid says, Tom, Daisy, mansion, they are living together in the mansion, and then the red, they don't really know what to do with it, I still can see what they did get. Like maybe they missed that, that color symbolism, but that's okay. Like that's not a failure. Whereas sometimes reading quizzes with multiple choice, you can't always see really where kids are. So I love that it's open-ended, but also closed. And, it's kind of a balance of giving kids challenge, but also giving them space. So that's a Sesame Street quiz question.
I love that. Like I want to do that when I get back to school, because that sounds so awesome. And it is hitting those skills that we need. So they're making a claim, they're defending that position, but also it kind of, hearing you talk about it, it reminds me of just the AP essays in general and how we're supposed to score them, because it's not a gotcha. It's not like, oh, you dropped down a score because you didn't do this. The rubric is a progression in a positive way. It's like, okay, you did this, but you didn't quite do this. So you get this score, not this score, because you weren't quite there yet. And so I like that idea of like not trying to do a gotcha. Because I feel like so many times, at least when I was in high school, the reading quizzes were a gotcha. It was
Me
like,
too.
on page 42, who said this? And it's like,
Who cares? Who actually cares?
Right. And it's like, it's not important, right? So yeah, I love that. So you said Sesame Street quizzes, you said one pagers. So what does a one pager look like? You might have different versions, but how can we incorporate a one pager?
Yeah, so a one pager again is going to really come back to some of those thematic pieces that you picked out at the beginning of designing the unit. So, you're gonna say maybe the skill you're working on is something. You're looking at perhaps foreshadowing, right? And how foreshadowing does it. That's kind of a literary one, but we'll go with it for now. And so that central skill or central concept, whatever you want to put at the center, is kind of what informs the filling of the page. So the one page is then full of images, symbols, text, students' own thoughts, snippets from other things. If it's like a mixed media, think of it like a collage. And then I basically give kids a prompt. So the prompt would say, how does so-and-so use such and such in this text, blah, 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 period. And then their answer is a collage rather than a traditional paragraph of writing. So they would have chunks of evidence, different images of characters. Sometimes they're more artistic than others, but it doesn't have to be. And it's just a different way of them to kind of mind map. You could also call a one pager, but it's really more of like a brain dump rather than a formal organized piece of writing. And I really like that because again, you're letting kids show what they do know, what they did gravitate toward. You're also going to notice when you look at all of them together that everyone's going one direction, but they're all really missing this kind of complexity, this other layer, which is exactly what formative assessment is supposed to do. It's supposed to inform your next move as a teacher. And so I really like it, when kids are showing me what they know rather than what I'm telling them I want to know. That's not really formative, right? Formative means they're helping me understand where to go next without it being kind of this, like, I'm just waiting for you, I'm just hanging out. Like it's not a free for all, but it is something that helps me understand them much better.
Yes, awesome. I love that as well. And like I know you're doing it off the cuff. I put you on the spot, but like the
That's
question
okay.
that you had asked, or like you had said that they would answer, sounded very similar to the stable wording of the prompts, like how does so-and-so do this? So you're thinking about maybe rhetorical choices if we're connecting it to RA. So any of those little ways to get them comfortable with some of the language surrounding the exam is helpful too. Because even terms like rhetorical situation can be scary at the beginning of the year, but they need to know what it is. We might not call it that right away, but just getting them used to the language surrounding the exam in these little ways too, I think helps. Because I think sometimes when people are thinking about incorporating a novel or like a longer work in general, the assumption is, well, there's nothing that long on the exam, therefore this is not AP Lang related. But like you've given us some great ways to make it AP Lang related by just incorporating like the language and the skills, and those kids will still be just as ready for the exam.
And a class period is still a class period length, right? Like whatever you're doing during the period is still up to you. Even if the kids are reading a novel, that doesn't mean that everything else gets pushed to the side.
Right.
I mean, I'm not having the kids read every period during class. I'm not doing read alouds with AP Lang. Think about it too well, and also I didn't have a choice. So I kind of walked into this and I had to wrap my head around it. So that was kind of nice because it wasn't a decision. It was given to me. So I didn't have to, a lot of AP Lang teachers get to make some of their own decisions, and that's super cool. But for me, I kind of like being told what to do because then I just work with what I got. And, I just kind of let the novel sit in the background of their minds. It's kind of like having a backdrop to the conversation that we're having in this unit about the essential question. Even the skills for me, like I know it's a very skill-based class, but as a human, I'm a very conceptual person and I like things connected. So I feel comfortable inside a novel unit as like a newer AP Lang teacher anyway. So I felt comfort in the timing and the pacing of a novel background unit. And that was just comfortable to me. And I don't think teachers have to go that route unless they're looking to try it, or they're kind of looking to shake things up. Like I said earlier, like a lit circle option is a really cool way to do this, and it doesn't have to be forever. And if the essential question is awesome, then the conversations are going to be awesome, and you're going to have no shortage of finding supplemental texts and things to go with it.
Yes, absolutely. So do you have any like final words of wisdom? Because I know you give out so much great info on your Instagram stories. We're going to link all that below in the description. But like, if you could leave AP Lang teachers with any advice, like a lot of us are just starting our year. Yeah. We're not back to normal, or whatever we're going to call normal. We're kind of still in some of the craziness. So what advice would you give AP Lang teachers at the beginning of their year?
I would say take a deep breath. And remember, like, I remember at my APSI, one of the best things I heard was the goal of AP Lang is to build thoughtful, informed citizens, period.
I love that. That is so true.
It is so true. And honestly, I wish I would have heard that phraseology much sooner in my career, because I believe that about all of my students. And I really wish I would have had more time to scaffold down Lang stuff into my other courses. But I think remembering that the children in front of you could have taken any other class, and they're there right now, they are ready to be challenged. And the challenge is developing thoughtful, informed citizens who can tackle a complex issue, have a conversation. And if the writing gets there, awesome. But getting the thinking there, that's a real victory, and something not to take lightly, because if you know that the conversations and the thought have absolutely made it at the end of the year, but the scores don't match, that's not a big deal. It's not a big deal. And that's where I would put your sights, is whenever you feel stressed about the rubric and the exam and getting things in and getting on AP Classroom and it's not working, just remember thoughtful, informed citizens. Because honestly, like, I don't know, I kept thinking our generation was going to fix things. I mean, things are getting progressively worse and harder to handle. So I'm so depending on this generation for so many things, and I want them to feel confident, feel strong about what they feel, but also know that they've got to be listening to each other. And, citizens is really, I think, the backbone of this course for me.
Yeah, I love that. I think we need that on a t-shirt or something, because, and it's not just AP Lang kids, like it's everybody, it's all our students. But yeah, you're absolutely right. Cause like, yes, we put a lot of focus on the exam. I know for my students, many of them, if they get a certain score, it means that they don't have to pay for a college class. And to them, that is absolutely huge. Like, that's paramount to them. But at the end of the day, like, yeah, test scores are great, but they don't always match to kids' ability. And standardized testing kind of stops at a certain point in your life, but you're a citizen for the rest of your life. So I love what you said about being like that thoughtful citizen. Like, we need to be able to speak and listen and analyze and all that. So I think that's great advice. So breathe. And then remember that it's more than just an exam-based class. Like, there's life skills going on.
Lots of them. And it's hard. It's a lot easier said than done. Kids definitely get lost in that black hole of exam stuff. And it's okay to have a little bit of pressure. Like, that's healthy, but deep breaths. All
right. Well, thank you so much for joining me. I am so excited. I know I've learned a lot just from being able to speak with you. Oh, wow. So please keep doing those Instagram stories, by the way, because I love seeing, like, when you show, like, this is my assignment and here's what I would do with it. I love that. I'm a visual learner, so Instagram stories are so fun. So please keep doing those. But yeah, thank you so much for taking time out to meet with me. I loved it. And I'm sure that the people viewing it will love it as well.
Well, so good to be here. Thank you everyone for watching. See you around. You guys can find me on Instagram at Mud and Ink Teaching. You can find me on Apple Podcasts at Brave New Teaching. And yeah, I'm here to chat if you ever need anything.
All right. Well, thank you, Amanda.